I stood by the window, watching as the weak outlines of the city streets slowly emerged in the pale light of dawn. The previous night had turned into a kaleidoscope of agonizing thoughts and feelings that I just couldn't contain. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The face of the woman who had once been the closest person to me, and yet the one who had delivered the deepest blow. How had it come to pass that Emily became the source of my greatest pain? Didn't I do everything I could to make her happy? Wasn't I attentive and gentle, always ready to support her in difficult moments? The sense of betrayal cut me like a blade. The feeling of my own inadequacy became almost unbearable. I kept wondering what I lacked, why she had taken that step, and where that chasm between us had come from. Had our entire relationship been nothing but an illusion? Or perhaps in the beginning, everything was truly sincere. But then something went terribly wrong. I replayed our first meeting countless times in my mind. Her smile, the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about her paintings, and the growing excitement within me at the thought that I had finally met someone with whom I could share both joy and sorrow. But now everything had changed. It was as if the Emily I once knew had vanished forever, replaced by a stranger capable of betrayal. Deep down, I understood that she hadn't suddenly become someone else. Rather, I had failed to notice how both of us had changed, how unspoken words, resentments, and tensions had built up. Love is fragile, and if you don't nurture it with care, trust, and attention, everything that once seemed unbreakable can shatter. Yet realizing this did nothing to ease the pain that had shattered the trust between us when Emily admitted she was with another. Outside, the early sun painted the roofs of neighboring houses in a faint orange hue. I could hear a car honking somewhere in the distance and the murmurs of a few early pedestrians. The city was waking up and carrying on with its life, while inside me, the night of doubts and despair still reigned. I clutched my head in my hands and felt tears welling up again. I never imagined that simply realizing she had cheated on me could be so excruciating and paralyzing. After a while, I realized I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. Everything there reminded me of Emily. The photographs on the fridge, her brushes and paints she once brought over, even a couple of her forgotten books on the shelf. I couldn't bear the sight of those things. Every object seemed to scold me. Look, you thought you had a future together, and now everything has fallen apart. For the first time in my life, I clearly felt that my once familiar surroundings had turned into a hostile territory, where even the smallest detail only deepened the wound. I quickly gathered my things, threw on my jacket, and stepped out into the cool air. The fresh chill helped clear my thoughts a little. I walked aimlessly, just wanting to get away from the memories and the sorrow that haunted me within those four walls. I walked and walked, hoping to silence that inner voice that kept repeating, "She betrayed you, she ruined everything." After about half an hour, my feet led me to the riverfront. There, near the water, lonely benches stood under trees swaying gently in the wind, and there were hardly any passers-by. I sat on one of the benches and stared blankly at the river. The water flowed slowly, reflecting the rays of the rising sun, and for a moment it seemed as if things might return to the way they were. But it was a deceptive feeling. One couldn't simply rewind time and fix everything. Thoughts of calling Emily surged and then faded away. I knew I wasn't in a state to speak with her calmly right now. And what could I say? "How could you?" Or, "Don't you feel any remorse for what you did?" But she had already confessed yesterday that she had another man, that her involvement with him had escalated quickly and spiraled out of control. Perhaps she did regret it, but that didn't make it any easier for me. Inside, I was burning with anger, and I knew I wasn't yet capable of forgiving her with a light heart. Then, unexpectedly, my phone vibrated in my pocket. At first, I didn't want to take it out, fearing to see her name flash on the screen. But the vibration persisted, and reluctantly, I looked at the display. It was Michael, my friend and colleague, the very person through whom I had first met Emily. I remembered that I had turned off my phone the previous day and hadn't been reachable, so he had probably been trying to contact me for a while. "Hey," I said quietly as I answered. "Jacob, buddy, where have you been? I've called you several times. Are you okay?" His voice was laced with concern. "Sorry, I wasn't in a state to talk," I replied honestly. "Okay, I know something's happened, or at least it seems that way. You're just not yourself lately." I remained silent for a long moment, unsure of how to condense the storm raging inside me into a few words, but I knew I couldn't keep it all inside any longer, or it would tear me apart. "Emily," I began, hesitating. "It turns out she's with someone else." "Damn," Michael responded softly. "Listen, Jacob, are you at home? Maybe I should come over?" "I'm not home. I'm at the riverfront, near the old bridge, actually." "Got it. I'll call a cab and come get you. Don't go anywhere, okay?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. And for a brief moment, I felt a bit of relief knowing that soon I wouldn't have to face this alone. I knew I didn't want to be around noisy crowds right now, but I also couldn't bear being entirely alone. Michael was the only person who truly understood both me and what was happening. After all, he was the one who had introduced me to Emily at that party. He likely didn't feel guilty, but he surely was worried too. While waiting for Michael to arrive, memories of our friendship flooded back. Michael was one of those rare people who could lighten the mood with a joke when everyone else just offered pitying glances. We'd been through many tough situations at work, and I always knew I could count on his steady sense and calm demeanor. And if anyone could help me not lose my mind right now, it was him. At last, I saw his tall figure striding along the riverfront. Michael waved at me, and I stood up to greet him. He looked me in the eyes, and I could see all my pain written across my face. "Man, this is rough," he said, giving me a quick hug. "Tell me everything." "Let's sit down," I suggested. We returned to the bench. Michael wanted to grab coffee at a nearby cafe, but I refused. I wasn't in the mood for anything. He sat next to me and began listening to my halting story. About how I'd discovered an unfamiliar pendant on her, how rumors had started about her meeting another guy, how I'd found a photo of them embracing, and finally, how she herself admitted that she had been cheating on me for a long time. I even mentioned James, the name Emily had given in her confession. Michael shook his head and muttered under his breath before asking, "So what now? How do you feel?" "Like I've been split open and paraded around for everyone to laugh at. It's like a knife has been stuck in my heart," something like that. "I get it," he sighed. "Listen, you have to understand that it's not your fault, in the sense that you can't be responsible for someone else's choices. She made that decision on her own." "Yeah, but I keep thinking, what if I wasn't enough to make her feel loved? Maybe I was too wrapped up in work, too self-centered. Believe me, if someone decides to cheat, it's not just because you forgot to buy her flowers once or didn't ask about her day. Relationships are complicated, but betrayal is a deliberate act." I knew he was right, yet it didn't make it any easier. I felt as if I was still searching for an explanation within myself. Maybe it was that I was simply too plain, not interesting enough, too engrossed in my projects. After all, Emily was an artist who needed constant emotional nourishment, while I was often buried in lines of code, losing track of her inner world. "Listen, you need to give yourself some time right now," Michael said, noting my silence. "Don't try to figure it all out in one day. I think you'd be better off taking a break from her, reflecting on what you feel, and only then decide if you're ready to interact with her again." "That sounds logical," I replied, "but inside it hurts so much I feel like I'll never forget this." "Well, maybe you won't ever forget, but over time, the wounds will heal, and the most important thing is, you won't be alone. I and the other friends will be there for you." I felt an overwhelming gratitude toward him. In that moment, I just wanted to dissolve into silence and the absence of pain. But the pain wouldn't let go. We talked a while longer, and I realized I needed to somehow distract myself, to do something so I wouldn't drown in my misery. Michael suggested I go to his place, play some video games, or watch a silly movie, anything to take my mind off things. I hesitated at first, but then agreed. After all, the alternative was returning to an empty apartment where every object reminded me of Emily. We hailed a cab and headed to Michael's house. On the way, I caught myself calming down slightly for the first time in a while. No, I wasn't no longer hurting, but with a friend who didn't judge or pity me, I felt less isolated in my misery. Perhaps that's what support is all about. When we arrived, I even managed to force myself to have a cup of coffee. Michael put on some outrageous comedy with off-color jokes, and we sat in semi-silence for an hour and a half, occasionally chuckling. I stared at the screen, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. Yet, thanks to the movie and the atmosphere, I managed to temporarily put aside the sharpest pain. At one point, when the movie had ended, we sat in silence and Michael asked, "Hey, maybe you should get away for a couple of days? Go visit your parents or somewhere you feel at peace?" "My parents are far away. Besides, if I show up at their door, they'd start asking questions. I'm not sure I'm ready to tell them everything. Maybe just get out of town for a bit, rent a room in some modest hotel, take a walk in the park or the woods, clear your head." "Honestly, I don't know," I shrugged. "Maybe it isn't a bad idea, even if just for the weekend." I understood that a change of scenery might help, but a part of me stubbornly clung to the thought that I needed to stay and resolve things, maybe even talk to Emily. Yet imagining another conversation sent another wave of pain and anger through me. I didn't know what else to say except, "Why? Or how could you?" In the end, we agreed that I would stay with Michael for a while. He offered me his couch for the night, and I accepted, though I felt awkward imposing. I just couldn't return to my lonely apartment. At least here, in the familiar presence of a friend, I felt a bit more at ease. At dinner, we talked about work, reminisced about funny office stories, and discussed plans for upcoming projects. I felt the weight of prolonged stress building inside me. My eyes grew heavy, and my head felt as if I'd just run a marathon. Before bed, Michael once again suggested that I take a couple of days away out of town, and I promised I'd think about it tomorrow. But left alone in the living room, I drifted back into thoughts about Emily. Her tear-filled eyes when she pleaded for forgiveness, her words that everything had gone too far, all of it flooded back. I tried to find an answer to whether one could ever forgive an act of infidelity if the loved one truly repents. But maybe she didn't truly repent after all. Maybe she just felt guilty, while still harboring feelings for James? And would she remain with him? When your mind is full of such thoughts, sleep seems nearly impossible. I tossed and turned on the couch, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall. Every tick echoed in my mind like a refrain. Betrayal, betrayal. Only near dawn did I finally drift off, only to wake closer to noon, when Michael was bustling in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. He offered to make eggs for both of us. Soon, I sat at the table, trying desperately not to look at the phone that lay on the windowsill. Deep down, I hoped to see a message from Emily, something like, "I'm sorry, I want to talk, I want to explain." But there was nothing. Her silence perhaps meant that she didn't even know what she wanted. After finishing my coffee, I felt a surge of determination. Maybe I really should get away for a couple of days? If Emily wasn't texting, then there was no point in sitting here waiting for her like a ship at sea. Spending time in the city only tormented me with memories and unanswered questions. I needed a new backdrop to escape, even for a short while, in order to regain some inner balance. "Michael," I said to my friend, "thanks for everything. I think I'll pack a few things, grab the car, and head out into nature." "That's the spirit," he said with relief. "Call me anytime, all right? And don't worry about work. I'll tell the boss you need a break." "Thanks. Without you, I'd have completely broken down." Michael patted my shoulder in a gesture of support. I felt his approval of my decision to get some distance. Gathering myself, I thanked him once more and headed home to pack. My heart was heavy, but a semblance of clarity began to emerge. I needed to put some distance between myself and all this, at least for a while. Arriving at my apartment, I noticed my heart beating faster at the thought of seeing those objects that reminded me of Emily again. But I steeled myself. I quickly tossed a few items, a couple of warm sweaters, some sweatpants, and essentials, into my bag. I tried not to glance around, not lingering on the photos or little things she had left behind. Yet, my eyes caught her mug with the paintbrush and palette design, a birthday gift I'd given her. I closed my eyes, trying not to break down from a fresh surge of pain. Within half an hour, I was sitting in my car, wondering where to go. I remembered a small town by a lake where my parents used to take me on vacations. It was quiet there, with clean air, and it was only a 3 or 4 hour drive. I decided it was the perfect place to hide from the chaos for a couple of days. On the drive, I listened to the radio, sometimes catching myself unable to focus on the songs or the news. My mind kept drifting back to Emily and my suffering. Yet, the journey helped distract me as I focused on the road and the scenery outside. After a couple of hours, I began to feel a little lighter. Perhaps it was just an illusion, but I clung to any chance to feel alive again. When I finally arrived in that small town, it turned out that things weren't as idyllic as I had hoped. The weather had suddenly taken a turn, and a light rain had begun. But I wasn't dismayed. I checked into a modest local hotel, dropped off my things, and decided to take a walk along the lake under my umbrella. The place was nearly deserted, especially in such weather. A few lone fishermen sat on the shore, and the wind rippled the surface of the water. Walking along the bank, I stared into the gray distance where the sky merged with the lake. Thoughts raced through my mind. Why did this happen to me? Then another thought. Why not me? Millions go through infidelity and breakups. I'm not unique. Strangely enough, this realization calmed me a bit. I understood that I wasn't the first or the last to be betrayed, and there was a path others had taken before me. Surely, I too could eventually find a way forward. Returning to the hotel, I sat by the window and gazed out. The rain had intensified, droplets ran down the glass. It seemed as if nature itself shared my sorrow. I took out my phone and checked. No missed calls, no messages. I closed my eyes and tried to feel what was happening inside me. The pain hadn't disappeared, but a certain detachment had set in. Here, far from home, without familiar sights or her belongings around, the sting of memories wasn't as sharp. I realized I had a few choices: continue wallowing in guilt and questions, try to forget it all as if it were a terrible dream, or eventually find the strength to talk to her and set things straight. But first, I needed to regain my balance. I knew that ahead of me there might be forgiveness, anger, tears, and countless unsaid words. But at that moment, I just wanted one thing: some respite from the inner storm. The phone rang, and this time it was my mom. My heart sank. I didn't want to talk about my troubles, yet I couldn't ignore the call. I mumbled a half-truth that I'd taken a short trip to get away and that I was fine. Perhaps she sensed something was off, but she tactfully didn't pry. I promised I'd visit them soon, and we said our goodbyes. Left alone in the silence, I realized I had to accept what had happened. It wasn't certain that Emily would write or call again. Perhaps she was with James, or maybe she was in her studio, painting another piece in an attempt to forget me. Or maybe she was tormented by her conscience. I couldn't know for sure. But for now, I had to focus on healing my own heart and restoring my faith in myself. With those thoughts, I lay down on the bed, wrapped myself in the blanket, and allowed sleep to take over. Though the sleep was restless and filled with strange visions, at least for a while, I was detached from the bitter reality. I dreamed of endless corridors where I searched for Emily, only for her to vanish like a shadow whenever I got close. I woke up that evening when it was still drizzling outside. It had grown colder, so I turned on the heater. I wasn't hungry or thirsty, though many hours had passed since lunch. But I knew I had to take care of myself physically, so I headed down to the hotel lobby and found a vending machine with sandwiches and hot drinks. I grabbed something at random, returned to my room, munched quietly, and once again contemplated how to emerge from this ordeal with the least amount of damage. Memories of Michael's words resurfaced. He'd said that people don't change overnight, that infidelity is the result of many small steps leading to betrayal. Did that mean Emily had long since stopped loving me? Or that she had grown tired of our relationship while I remained oblivious? Perhaps she needed more passion, and I was simply too much of a nice guy. But what's the point of dissecting these questions when the facts remained unchanged? She betrayed me, and yet, perhaps I still loved her. And that only made the pain all the more excruciating. I realized that eventually I'd have to decide what to do next. Perhaps, once I returned home, we'd have another conversation, one without tears and shock. But could I ever trust her again? Believe in her words? And could I ever forget that photo, her tears, her confession? Or was it better to cut her out of my life completely? To erase both of us along with the pain? Deep inside, the anguish only grew. I knew that if I continued to dwell in this limbo, I'd never heal. I opened the window and felt a rush of damp air from the lake. The smell of wet earth and fresh water simultaneously reminded me of that past trip to the sea when we had spent a week together. Back then, we were so happy, as if the entire world belonged only to us. Where had it all gone? Had our feelings been so fragile that they couldn't withstand the trials of time and circumstance? These questions seemed to have no answers. And even if they did, I wasn't ready to hear them now. I knew I'd have to endure a period of pain, anger, and disappointment before I could even begin to forgive, whether forgiving Emily or forgiving myself for allowing it all to happen. Wrapped in a blanket, I stared out at the dark silhouettes of the trees and felt a quiet determination forming within me. I wouldn't let this destroy my life completely. I was a living person with my own feelings, and I would survive, even if it meant spending a long time mending my wounded soul. And though there would be many more questions and inner turmoil ahead, I wouldn't give up. That night, I fell asleep restlessly again. But this time, without the same sense of doomed inevitability that had haunted me before. I dreamt surreal images where colors blended into one another, forming sometimes the face of Emily, sometimes that of a stranger. I drifted in and out of sleep, seeking in my dreams the answers I couldn't grasp in the waking world. Finally, by dawn, exhaustion claimed me, granting a few hours of oblivion, where at least the searing pain of betrayal was. The next morning, a soft knock at the door woke me up. At first, I didn't even realize where I was, until I stirred and felt a dull ache throughout my body from having slept in someone else's bed. I was still in that small hotel by the lake. The knock came again, and I reluctantly got up, threw on a sweatshirt, and opened the door. Standing on the threshold was the hotel manager, a kindly older man with a gentle face. He informed me that someone had attached a note to my car. Apparently, he'd seen a young woman approach the vehicle, leave a piece of paper under the fender, and then quickly leave. It struck me as strange and somewhat unnerving. No one was supposed to know I was here except Michael, and even then I hadn't given out the exact address. When I asked him to describe the girl, he gave a vague description: young, dark-haired, of medium height. Of course, it could have been anyone, but deep inside I felt a jolt at the thought. It might have been Emily. I sat down in my room and wondered why she had suddenly come after me. Then I quickly put on my sneakers and headed to the parking lot where my car was parked. Sure enough, there was a folded piece of paper attached to the fender. My heart pounded as I unfolded it and read the few handwritten lines. "Forgive me for everything. I wanted to talk but realized I wasn't ready to see you so suddenly. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I just wanted to say that I miss you. Emily." My heart skipped a beat when I saw her signature. A whirlwind of thoughts raced through my mind. Why had she come here? How did she know where I was? What did she want to say? Had she come to follow me? Or perhaps Michael had given her my coordinates without considering that I might not be ready to face her? Or maybe Emily had somehow guessed where I might be. In any case, she left without leaving a number or any way to contact her. Just that short note, like a sign asking for forgiveness. But how could I talk to her now? I stood there for several minutes, holding the note, as the words "forgive me for everything" replayed in my mind. I imagined her coming here, perhaps hesitating, not knowing if she should meet me in person. And in the final moment, she decided simply to leave the note and disappear. Did I want to rush out after her, demand explanations? Maybe I did, but I had no idea where to look for her, since the manager said she had left on foot, and I didn't even know which direction she'd gone. I slowly returned to my room, sat on the bed, and stared at the note written in her sprawling handwriting. Inside, a storm of emotions churned. On one hand, I felt a tinge of relief. Perhaps she had realized what she had done and truly regretted it. On the other, there was a deep-seated bitterness. Simple words like, "forgive me," could hardly erase the pain of betrayal. Moreover, if she really wanted to talk, why hadn't she stayed? Trying to steady my trembling hands, I thought that maybe I wasn't ready for a conversation. At least, not in a state where my emotions were still at their peak. Perhaps Emily sensed it and decided not to provoke a conflict. Or maybe she was simply afraid of hearing my harsh words or seeing my anger. In any case, I had a strong feeling that I wasn't ready to meet her. I needed more time. Her tears and confessions still haunted my mind, and I knew the same burning resentment was waiting to erupt into a destructive argument if we met. And I didn't want that. I just needed to understand what was happening to me and how I would live on. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I wandered around the neighborhood, gazing at the lake views, trying to savor the silence that was supposed to heal me. But even that quiet was disturbed by the thought that Emily might be nearby, that she had just left this place, and I almost felt her presence. I would catch myself looking at the passing figures, searching for familiar facial features or a distinctive gait. But of course, it was all in vain. She had vanished. By evening, I returned to my room and found myself mentally talking to her. Why did you think one note was enough? Why are you apologizing when you're with someone else? Why didn't you talk to me before it all went so far? These questions swirled bitterly in my head, and I knew they wouldn't lead anywhere, yet I couldn't stop the internal dialogue. On one hand, I wanted to call her, to shout everything I felt, but on the other, I was afraid to hear her voice, afraid I wouldn't be able to control my emotions. At the same time, I felt that beneath the anger, there were still feelings that wouldn't be easily extinguished. That infuriated me even more, because you can't simply command your heart to stop loving. That night, I slept poorly again, waking several times from distressing dreams in which Emily appeared and disappeared, leaving me utterly confused. When morning finally came, I looked worn out. Staring at my reflection in the mirror, I decided it was time to go back home, no matter how hard it would be. I couldn't keep isolating myself here in this hotel, knowing that Emily might be nearby or that she had already left. I felt that this prolonged pause wouldn't give me answers or solve the problem. I had to decide, either completely cut off all contact with her, or eventually hear her out. But I could only make that decision in a familiar setting. After packing my things and paying for the room, I slowly drove out of the town. The weather was dry but overcast, as if nature itself sympathized with my distress. The journey home passed under the hum of engines and my constant rumination over my next steps. I understood that a meeting with Emily was inevitable, unless I ran away further. But that wouldn't solve anything. One way or another, we had to talk. The question was whether I was ready to hear her explanations without exploding into accusations. When I arrived at my home, a pang hit me at the thought of all the times Emily and I had entered that door together, bringing groceries, laughing, cooking dinner. Now it all felt like memories from someone else's life. I went upstairs, entered my apartment, and immediately sensed that something was off. I had a strong feeling someone had been here while I was away. I looked around carefully. In the kitchen, on the table, lay a note. The same note, but with new words. "I can't find a way to talk to you, so I'm leaving this here. If you're ready to talk, I'll wait. If not, I'll understand, Emily." I gritted my teeth. How had she gotten into my apartment? Had I forgotten to lock the door, or had she found a spare key that was once hidden in a drawer near the entrance? I couldn't remember ever giving her a copy of my key, but in relationships, it wasn't uncommon to leave keys with each other. My memories blurred. But one thing was clear. Emily was trying to find a way to reach out, and perhaps I should have responded more humanely, instead of just hiding away. A new wave of bitterness washed over me. Why did she think she had the right to intrude into my life after everything she'd done? Then I caught myself thinking that perhaps she too was in a bad state, trying to explain herself in a disjointed way. I couldn't know her motives for sure. Maybe James had left her and she now regretted it? Or perhaps she truly loved me and finally realized she had made a fatal mistake. For a while, I just stood there, staring at the note. The words, "I'll wait," weighed on me. Where was she waiting? In her studio? We had no agreed meeting place. Eventually, I decided to take it step by step. First, I would call Michael and ask if he had spoken with Emily. Perhaps he knew how she ended up in that town and how she got here. Michael answered immediately. "Jacob, welcome back. How are you? Where have you been?" "I went out of town, remember? But I'm back now. Listen, I have a question for you. Did you tell Emily where I was?" "What?" He sounded surprised. "No, of course. I didn't know exactly where you were going. I just assumed you'd go someplace quiet. Why would I tell her? Did she call you?" "No, but she somehow learned that I was staying in a hotel. She went there and left a note, and apparently she even came to my apartment while I was away. That sounds eerie, but it seems like she really is trying to see you. How do you feel about it? Honestly, I still don't know how I feel. On one hand, the anger and pain won't leave me, and on the other, I don't want to keep running away all my life. I think we need to talk. I think that's a good idea, Michael said. But only do it when you're ready, and don't let her play with your emotions. You need to stay calm to figure out what you really want. I thanked him for the advice and hung up. The apartment was still suffocatingly silent. Suddenly, it hit me that I had always tried to be rational and calm, but now, controlling myself was becoming incredibly difficult, especially since my heart was shattered. And yet, I understood that meeting with Emily was inevitable, and it was best to do it on my own terms, not waiting for her to catch me off guard again. I decided to take out my phone and send her a message first. I found her name in my contacts, which had once been the most cherished in my list. My fingers trembled and my heart pounded as I typed, "Emily, I'm back. If you really want to talk, let's meet tomorrow afternoon at the cafe on the corner of Oak Street and 7th Avenue. I kept it short, trying not to reveal the storm of emotions inside. I had to choose a neutral, public place so that neither of us would be tempted to erupt into yelling or tears. Almost immediately, I got a reply. "Thanks for writing. I'll come. We really need to talk. Forgive me." Those words made my anger flare up again. She was once again saying, "Forgive me," yet without any explanation. But I knew that explanations would likely follow at our meeting. I spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous tension, constantly glancing at the things in the apartment that reminded me of Emily. I tried to engage in household tasks to distract myself, but my hands wouldn't obey. My mind replayed countless scenarios of what the meeting might bring, from a heated argument to a potential reconciliation. I wasn't sure what I expected. Deep down, I still hoped that somehow we could rebuild our relationship if she truly repented and still loved me. Yet, a wave of resentment whispered, "How can you ever trust someone who betrayed you once?" That night proved to be another trial. I tossed in bed, trying to quell the storm of thoughts, but sleep eluded me. I got up a couple of times to drink water and stared out the window at the city's twinkling lights. I remembered how Emily once said that the city lights at night inspired her to create atmospheric paintings. Back then, I admired her ability to find beauty in the everyday, but now it only reminded me painfully of what I had lost. Finally, after a long struggle, I managed to get up more broken than when I had gone to bed. Still, I felt that the necessity of this meeting gave me a strange sense of resolve. I rushed through a shower, grabbed a light snack, even though I had no real appetite, and left home half an hour before the appointed time to take a walk and calm my nerves. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. I chose a table by the window, ordered a cup of black coffee, and began to wait. My heart pounded wildly, though outwardly I tried to appear calm. I remembered Michael's advice, "Don't let her manipulate you." Yet I knew keeping my emotions in check wouldn't be easy. After all, I was about to face the person I had once loved with all my heart, the person who had delivered the most crushing blow. Emily arrived a little later than I expected. When she walked in, I could barely hold back the tremor in my hands. She was dressed in a modest coat and scarf, her hair slightly disheveled by the wind. Her face was etched with sadness and a hint of shyness that I had never noticed in her before. She saw me, nodded, approached the table, and paused for a moment as if gathering her strength. Then she quietly said, "Hi." I simply nodded, staring at her without smiling. Inside, everything tightened because I saw a trace of loss in her eyes, as if she had realized that we were no longer the same people who once loved each other without a shadow of doubt. She sat down opposite me. I asked if she wanted something to drink, but she just shook her head, then quietly began, "Jacob, I don't know how to say everything I'm feeling right now. I have no excuses. I just want to explain what happened and how I feel." I remained silent, letting her know that I was there to listen. Emily swallowed hard and continued, I really got caught up with James. We met at one of the exhibitions. He's also an artist, and we immediately got into a conversation about our work. At first, it was just friendly, but at some point I realized I wanted to see him more often, to discuss projects, to share my most intimate thoughts about painting and inspiration. I knew I was crossing a line, but I couldn't stop myself. It felt like a new emotion, something that lifted me up. I clenched my fists under the table. Hearing this was agonizing, yet I forced myself to listen. Emily spoke softly, not looking me in the eyes. During that time, it felt like we were drifting apart. I knew you noticed how I was becoming withdrawn, but I couldn't admit it. I was ashamed, yet at the same time I felt drawn to James more and more. We began meeting in secret. I couldn't believe that I was capable of this, but it happened. He told me that he understood me like no one else, that we were kindred spirits. I was as if hypnotized. At those words, a storm of emotions erupted within me. Hypnotized. Understood like no one else. Did that mean she no longer considered me someone close? but I kept silent, clenching my teeth until it felt as though they would crack. Emily cast a brief glance at my face and continued. I knew it was betrayal, but at the same time, I couldn't find the strength to leave either him or you. I deceived myself into thinking that everything would eventually be okay. I thought I could lead both lives simultaneously, but that was an illusion. At that moment, I let out a heavy sigh. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Maybe we could have talked it out, found a way out, or at least broken up amicably without all the lies? My voice faltered because the pain and bitterness were too intense. Emily lowered her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I was afraid of a breakup, afraid of losing everything, and in the end, I lost. For a moment, she fell silent as if gathering her thoughts. Then she said, I broke up with James. He left for another city. He has new projects, and I stayed behind. Only after he was gone did I realize how precious your care, your understanding, your calm presence was. You never demanded the impossible from me. You always supported me, and I ruined it all. Now I'm asking for your forgiveness, not because I want to go back to the way things were, but because I can't live with the knowledge that I hurt you so deeply and didn't even say a simple, I'm sorry. A mixture of anger and pity swirled inside me. Part of me was relieved to hear that his relationship had ended, yet at the same time, it sounded as if she only realized the value of what we had once it was too late. Should I really be happy about that? So, if he hadn't left, would you have continued living a double life? I asked bitterly. Emily squeezed her hands on her lap. I don't know. Maybe I would have kept lying to myself and to you. Or maybe I would have understood everything, but too late. I really can't say. I was too confused. We fell silent. I could hear the distant clatter of dishes and a phone ringing in another part of the cafe. It all seemed like a far-off noise while my world centered solely on Emily and my broken soul. I felt tears welling up, but I didn't want to show weakness. Finally, I asked, why did you come looking for me now? What do you want from me? She looked at me timidly. I'm not expecting you to forgive me and take me back. I knew that might be impossible, but I wanted you to know that I'm truly ashamed, that I deeply regret what I did, and that I still love you. And if you need time or space, I'll understand. I just didn't want our breakup to pass in silence, without an attempt to explain. A storm of emotions surged inside me. I loved her, and her words made my heart tighten. Yet the betrayal still stood like a wall between us. I imagined us trying to recapture our old closeness, but I couldn't shake the image of her with James. It felt as though that wound was too deep to be patched up with words. I bowed my head, trying to find any coherent words, but I only managed to say, I don't know how to live with what you did. Emily nodded, tears in her eyes. I understand, and I won't push you. Just know that I'm here if you ever want to talk, if you ever decide you're ready to try again. And if not, I'll accept that, no matter how much it hurts. We sat in tense silence for several minutes. I looked at her, remembering everything we had been through together. The warmth of our past meetings and touches mingled with images of deceit and betrayal. I felt as if I couldn't breathe. Finally, I quietly said, I need time. I can't say right now if I'll ever forgive this, but at least, thank you for finding the strength to explain. She stood up, without another word, and giving me one final sorrowful look, walked toward the door. I heard her footsteps fade, and suddenly I realized I didn't know when or if I'd see her again. But I didn't call her back. I felt that it wasn't possible right now. Too much pain and uncertainty still clouded everything. After finishing my cold coffee, I left the cafe. The streets outside seemed gray, even though the day was quite sunny. I wandered aimlessly, knowing that this meeting hadn't brought me any immediate relief. Yes, now I knew she had realized her mistake, that her relationship with James was over, that she was asking for my forgiveness. But did that automatically ease my suffering? No. The pain remained, the memories persisted, and along with them came the torturous questions about the future. On one hand, I felt a flicker of hope. What if we could rebuild our relationship, start anew, heal our wounds over time, and learn to trust again? But on the other, a part of me angrily protested. She betrayed you once, so why would you think it won't happen again? Even if she repents now, can you live with the thought that you might be betrayed again at any moment? And that internal dialogue continued relentlessly as I walked along the busy streets. In the end, I realized I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly and decided to go back home. Opening the door to my apartment, I immediately felt an even stronger emptiness. I had once believed that Emily and I would live together, that we'd create a home filled with the scent of her paints, my coffee, that we'd hang her paintings on the walls and share the joy of each new day. Now, everything reminded me of plans that had crumbled. I collapsed onto the couch and buried my face in my hands. The image in my mind was painfully clear. Everything Emily and I had, our friendship, our love, our trust, had shattered like a porcelain cup that could never be mended without leaving cracks. I wanted to scream, but instead, I choked in a tangle of emotions. I don't know how long I lay there, lost in my pain, until I finally decided that things couldn't continue this way. Gathering what little strength I had left, I reached for the phone. I wanted to call Michael and tell him how the meeting with Emily had gone. Perhaps his calm voice could help me see things more clearly. However, when I picked up the phone, I noticed a message from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was spam, but when I opened it, I read, "Jacob, hi, this is Sam. I hope you don't mind. I got your contact from a mutual acquaintance. It's about Emily. Can we talk?" My heart pounded. Sam? The same name I'd once seen on her phone? The one whose name had sparked my jealousy and suspicion? And now he was saying he had something to tell you about Emily? I couldn't understand what it all meant. Maybe he was a friend of James? Or did he have his own designs on her? With trembling hands, I typed back, "Who are you, and why do you want to talk to me about Emily?" Almost immediately, he replied, "I'm not your enemy, calm down. I just think you'd benefit from knowing some details. I can come over if you want." I was stunned. On one hand, I had no desire to dive back into that mess and uncover more about her relationships. On the other, curiosity and anxiety overtook me. What could he possibly know that Emily hadn't told me? Or maybe it was a prank or a trap? In the end, I decided I needed to find out the truth, no matter how unpleasant. It was better to know than to stew in uncertainty. Gathering my resolve, I wrote, "Okay, I have some time now. I can meet at the cafe near my house." He replied that he would be there in an hour. And so, that very day, I headed to the cafe to meet yet another stranger who claimed to know something about my personal drama. I felt like the hero of a cheap TV drama, with the intrigue only thickening. But there was no turning back now. I had to see it through and uncover every detail, however painful. Approaching the cafe, I nervously scanned the area, trying to guess who this Sam might be. On the outdoor terrace, a young man in a jacket was sipping his coffee nervously. He noticed me and raised his hand in greeting. I cautiously approached. The man introduced himself. "Hi, Jacob. I'm Sam. Sorry for the sudden request, but I need to talk to you about Emily." I sat down opposite him, unable to hide my tension, and said, "I'm listening. Who are you, and what do you know?" He looked around as if he didn't want us to be overheard and said, "I'm acquainted with Emily. We used to cross paths in art circles. I also know James, though we aren't friends. He participated in an exhibition where I also displayed some work. Now, I've learned that James isn't entirely honest about his intentions. I heard that he often does this. He gets close to young, in-relationships artists, and then vanishes when he loses interest." I frowned. "So what? Does that give me any reason to change anything? Emily made her choice. I'm not trying to excuse her actions." Sam nodded in understanding. "I get it. But maybe you should know that Emily isn't the only one he seduced. I saw him interacting with her and saying the same things he said to another girl a year earlier. All of it about kindred spirits, true understanding of art, an incomparable aura, and so on. He literally seduced her emotionally, knowing she was in a relationship and perhaps vulnerable or lonely. I think he was playing her. And no, I'm not trying to say Emily isn't at fault, but maybe it'll ease your mind to know she was caught in his trap." I sighed, unsure how to respond. Of course, this might explain a pattern in his behavior, but ultimately, Emily had made a conscious choice. Sensing my reaction, Sam added, "Sometimes it helps to understand what happened. Maybe Emily truly regrets it now because at some point she woke up from his false romance and realized he was only after his own desires. I'm not excusing her, but I thought you'd feel better knowing this." I grumbled. "Thanks, I guess. But why did you decide to tell me all this?" Sam lowered his gaze and said, "I was in a similar situation once, but from the other side. My girlfriend was stolen by a charismatic guy, and when I tried to figure out what happened, no one explained anything to me. I was left alone with my demons. So now I try to help people by shedding some light on these details." We talked a little more, and I realized that I had indeed gained some additional perspective about James. But it didn't change the main fact. Emily had cheated on me. Everything else was just context. Still, I thanked Sam for the information and said that I appreciated his willingness to help. Then he left, leaving me to ponder. It seemed that Emily might have been just one of the victims of a certain playboy in the art world, and when his interest in her waned, he simply vanished. But even if that were true, would it justify her betrayal of me? Probably not. I slowly walked home, feeling as if the picture of what had happened was gradually becoming clearer. Emily had fallen under James's influence, hitting a point of emotional vulnerability. She was an artist, seeking inspiration, dreaming of great recognition, and she met someone who supposedly understood her better than I did. But that still didn't excuse her making that choice. Now it was up to me whether I could accept her apologies and try to rebuild, or let her go, retaining only the pain and resentment. Back at my apartment, I felt utterly exhausted. The events of the past week, the conversation with Emily, the unexpected appearance of Sam, had drained me completely. Yet within me, a certain logical chain began to form. As painful as it was, I understood. Emily was free now. She had broken up with James, and most likely she truly regretted what she had done. But could I ever resurrect the feelings I once had? Or should I let her go forever? Late that evening, I sat at my computer and opened a blank document. I felt the need to pour out everything that was churning inside me, a kind of confession to myself. I, Jacob, was betrayed by the person I loved. I began, striving to be honest and restrained. I wrote about the resentment, the pain, the love that hadn't vanished but had turned bitter. I wrote about how I feared another betrayal, and about how I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive. After spilling my heart onto the page, I felt a small measure of relief. It was my personal therapy to put all that bitterness and confusion into words. Yet I still didn't know what decision to make. I only understood that it couldn't be rushed. Perhaps I would have to give Emily a chance to prove she truly repented. Or, on the contrary, I'd realize I couldn't ever forget and trust her again. Both options terrified me, but I knew I couldn't remain in this limbo forever. When I went to bed, my head buzzed with thoughts, but I managed to get a bit of sleep, though not without some eerie dreams. I woke up in the morning with a strange clarity. I couldn't decide our future alone. Emily needed to be a part of that process. She had to show me how committed she was to working on our relationship, or perhaps it was just guilt. And I knew that I, too, had to change if we were to start over. One couldn't simply revert to the old ways, because that very old order had led to our downfall. That was the beginning of a long and difficult journey. At least I had taken the first step toward realizing that I had a choice. And no matter what, I wouldn't let myself be a perpetual victim of this betrayal. I was a person, and I had the right to be happy, even if it meant enduring a hard process of forgiveness or even a final farewell. And I was determined that soon we would talk again with Emily, more thoroughly, to see if we had a chance to rebuild trust. If not, then it would be best to part ways for good. And if yes, we have to learn to live with our past without letting it poison our future. Because any love is a risk, and betrayal, as bitter as it is, can also be a part of fate that must be overcome. Only time would tell. A few days passed since that eventful, revealing week. I tried to get back into my usual routine, going to work, handling tasks, even joining colleagues for lunch. From the outside, it seemed I had recovered, but whenever I was alone, thoughts of Emily and all the unresolved questions came flooding back. I knew I was procrastinating, that time was moving on, yet I felt internally that I wasn't ready to rush anything. Seeing my despondency, Michael tried to cheer me up. He suggested we hit the sports court where we usually played basketball in the evenings. I wasn't a huge fan of the sport, but I figured that physical activity might help clear my mind a bit. We shot hoops, joked around, teased each other, until I finally felt physically exhausted. My body felt lighter, and for a short while, my thoughts were pushed aside. But when I returned home, I found myself alone again with my memories. I decided it was time to reach out to Emily, to invite her to talk once more, but this time not in a rush or at a cafe where we were surrounded by strangers, but in a more peaceful setting. I wanted to know if we could discuss the future of our relationship, if it was even possible. After all, I couldn't keep avoiding a decision forever. That same evening, I called her. She answered almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for my call. Her voice was soft and slightly trembling. I told her I wanted to meet and talk things over in more detail. She agreed, saying she could come over right then, but I suggested meeting the next day so I could gather my thoughts. We arranged that she would come to my place after work. There was a brief silence as we both contemplated what might happen. I said goodbye, and we hung up without uttering, "I miss you," or "I love you," which, in a way, perfectly captured the cold distance that had grown between us. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Thoughts about the upcoming conversation kept me from focusing, but I tried to concentrate on work. Fortunately, the project I was working on distracted me. There was a new feature to test and some bugs to fix. By midday, I realized I was so engrossed in work that I almost forgot about the meeting. But as evening drew near, the anxiety built up again. After returning home, I quickly tidied up the apartment, even though I knew that a clean room wouldn't solve our problems. Still, I wanted the environment to look calm and welcoming. I didn't cook, since I wasn't sure we'd even have dinner together, and simply made myself a cup of tea while watching the clock. Emily arrived almost exactly on time. I opened the door and she entered, clearly nervous. In her hands was a small bouquet of wildflowers, simple yet sincere. "I know this can't make up for what I did," she said as she handed them to me, "but I wanted to do something to show that I care." I took the bouquet, feeling a long-forgotten warmth in my chest. Yet I didn't allow myself to get too emotional. "Thank you. Please, come in." We moved into the living room. Emily looked around, noticing that I had removed some of her things that had been left behind. I met her gaze and said matter-of-factly, "I decided that since we're not together, I shouldn't hold on to your belongings as if nothing has changed." She nodded and sat on the sofa. I offered her some tea, but she declined. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to maintain composure. I sat next to her, but at a slight distance, as if an invisible barrier lay between us. "I want to understand if there's a future for us. And if there is, what kind of future?" I began without much preamble. We've already talked about your feelings and what happened. Now I need to know what you plan to do if I decide to try and get us back together. Emily looked into my eyes, her gaze full of both guilt and hope. I'm willing to do whatever it takes for you to trust me again. I know it won't happen overnight, but if you give me a chance. Her voice trembled as she lowered her eyes. What do you mean by whatever it takes? I asked, careful not to sound too harsh. I don't want empty promises. If we're going to move forward, we both have to change. I need to know what you're prepared to do. She paused, as if searching for the right words. I'm willing to undergo counseling with you if necessary. I'm ready to share every step of what I do if that will help reassure you. I'm willing to avoid those circles where the so-called hip artists hang out. I'm willing to do anything just to restore what we had. Her voice was sincere, though tinged with desperation. I felt conflicting emotions. On one hand, I was touched by her determination. On the other, I was terrified at the thought of having to play the role of a monitor, checking on her every move. I had never wanted such a relationship. I don't want to control every little thing you do, I said. And I'm not trying to cut you off from your world, but I need to know what's going on in your life. I want us to share our plans, our feelings, our doubts. No secrets, no hidden meetings, no half-truths. Emily nodded, looking up at me with eyes that seemed to reach for something. I want that too. I've realized that the secrecy and my own silence were what led to all of this tragedy. I need to learn to be open, even when I'm scared. And I know it will take time for you to fully forgive me. I won't rush you. We talked for about an hour. For the first time in months, I felt that Emily was truly listening, acknowledging her guilt without trying to make excuses. It was a hard, honest conversation, in which we accepted that the old version of us was gone, but maybe we could build something new from the ruins. Of course, it would take time, a lot of time. Before we ended the conversation, I suggested she stay for dinner, but warned that I wasn't ready for physical intimacy yet. I didn't want to rush things. Emily agreed, saying that even just being together was important. We went to the store, bought some groceries, and prepared a simple pasta with vegetables. Dinner passed almost without the usual laughter or ease, but at least we didn't feel like enemies. It was the first step toward learning to be together again. When it was time for her to leave, we both sensed that awkward moment of parting. In the past, she would stay the night. It was natural. Now, we had to set boundaries. Emily stood by the door, a bit hesitant, and softly asked, "May I hug you?" I hesitated for a moment but stepped forward, letting her embrace me. At first, my shoulders felt stiff, but gradually I remembered her scent and warmth. Tears welled in my eyes because that hug recalled moments when there was no gap between us. But I restrained myself. Emily didn't want it to turn into a melodrama either, so we parted quietly, agreeing to rebuild our communication gradually. After she left, I sat on the couch for a long time, trying to process what had happened. We had decided to give it another try, a beautiful-sounding notion, but I knew there were too many pitfalls ahead. I would have to learn to forgive and, more importantly, to not descend into paranoia. Emily would have to continuously prove her sincerity and that she wasn't playing with my feelings. It wouldn't be easy for either of us. But I chose that path because the alternative, a breakup, would mean endless suffering and the feeling that we hadn't even given ourselves a chance to fix things. The next day at work, I caught myself waiting for a message from Emily. "Did you get home all right? How are you feeling?" And she did send a brief, "Thanks for last night, it meant a lot. Hope you're okay." To which I replied just as briefly, "Thanks. I'm glad we talked." Those small steps seemed to bring us a little closer, yet I still felt cautious and unsure. That evening, I called Michael to update him. He listened carefully and then said, "Are you aware that you're in for a tough time? Betrayal doesn't just vanish. You might have bouts of jealousy. You might look for signs of her faithfulness in the smallest things. Are you ready for that?" I sighed. Honestly, I don't know if I'm emotionally prepared, but I know I can't avoid it. If I don't try, I'll always regret not giving love a chance. And if things fall apart again, I'll learn from it. Michael agreed that it was logical and promised he'd be there for me if I needed support. The following weeks were a true test. Emily made every effort to be as transparent as possible. She told me when and with whom she was meeting, called me to share her plans. In turn, I tried not to withdraw, openly admitting that from time to time, I was haunted by thoughts of James and her betrayal. Emily never dismissed my fears or got angry. She listened patiently and tried to reassure me that it was all over. Yet, deep inside, I remained guarded. One day, I caught myself wanting, almost involuntarily, to check her phone, scroll through messages or social media. It was a desire born out of fear. What if she was still hiding something? But I recalled that I didn't want to become a detective. Resisting the urge, I told her directly, "Sometimes I feel like looking through your messages to be sure you're not deceiving me. But I know that's wrong. I don't want to become a snoop." Emily, seeming to understand, offered, "You can check if you want. I have no secrets." But I declined. Trust isn't built on total surveillance. Still, there were many difficult moments. When Emily stayed out late without warning, my mind lit up with a question. What if she's with someone else? I hated myself for that suspicion, but I couldn't help it. In those moments, only honest conversations and her reassurances helped quell my doubts. Gradually, I noticed that she herself began warning me about any change in her plans, so as not to give me another reason to be jealous. I appreciated it, even though it felt a bit suffocating, as if she was constantly preoccupied with preventing me from having another outburst of distrust. Over time, we began spending more evenings together, restoring some of our old habits. We cooked dinner, talked about movies, and even went to a contemporary art exhibition, even though deep inside I was uneasy, thinking that in such places, Emily might have once met James. But to my surprise, she never showed any discomfort. On the contrary, she involved me in discussions about the exhibits, asked for my opinions, and joked that I was an IT guy who could analyze art from a coding perspective. I smiled, but inside, I still sensed that familiar crack of pain. At one point, I realized we were gradually returning to physical closeness. It happened unexpectedly one evening while we were watching a movie at my place. Emily rested her head on my shoulder. I felt that long, familiar warmth, mixed with anxiety. She turned slightly toward me. Our eyes met, and I realized that despite everything, there was still a magnetic pull between us. The kiss was cautious, yet laden with memories of past passion. But when I sensed that we might go further, something in my chest snapped. Images of her with James flashed before my eyes. I abruptly pulled away. Seeing the pain contort my face, Emily softly said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to rush it." I swallowed the lump in my throat, unable to explain that sometimes the thought of them together paralyzed me. I had to admit, I'm just not ready. Sometimes I imagine the two of you together, and it hurts too much. I don't know how to get that image out of my head. She lowered her eyes. I understand. I'll try to be more careful. I don't want you to be hurt. That night, we simply fell asleep side by side, without any further intimacy. Yet even the act of sharing a bed felt like a step forward, a sign that we were trying to mend the rift. However, when I woke the next morning, I felt mixed emotions. On one hand, I enjoyed the comfort and warmth of her presence, but on the other, I realized how fragile our situation was. One wrong move, word, or action could reopen old wounds with renewed force. Meanwhile, life continued as usual. Work demanded my attention, friends occasionally invited us to parties or get-togethers, where I was surprised that few could understand why we were trying to glue together the fragments, rather than start afresh on separate paths. But I wasn't obliged to explain our situation to anyone. This was between Emily and me. Of course, some friends supported us, saying that true love can withstand the harshest trials. I tried to maintain a balanced view, without putting myself on a pedestal as the all-forgiving one, yet not letting my soul be crushed by bitterness. Gradually, we reached a point where we had our first voluntary imposed weekend together. I call it that because we consciously decided to disconnect from social life, to not meet anyone else, and spend Saturday and Sunday alone, trying to restore what had been lost. We rented a small country house, a modest cottage, for 2 days, filled it with food, books, and a laptop. We decided to walk, cook together, watch movies, and talk. It would be a lie to say those 2 days were blissfully happy. I noticed that sometimes Emily would suddenly fall silent and look at me with worry, as if afraid I might leave or get angry. I caught myself recalling her confession at times, but every time one of us began to spiral into painful memories, the other would take our hand, embrace, or simply start a conversation about what troubled us. Ultimately, it was communication that saved us. And yet, during that weekend, there were moments of brightness. We cooked dinner together, laughed at each other's clumsy attempts to ski. There was light snow and a nearby spot where you could ride, sat by the fireplace with cups of hot tea, and watched the flames. In those moments, I started to believe again that we had a chance. I saw in Emily the woman I had once fallen in love with, only now she was more vulnerable and more honest. When we returned to the city, I felt that a fragile but genuine connection had formed between us. Yes, the shadow of infidelity still loomed, but I recognized that if we kept working on our relationship, that shadow could eventually fade. It wouldn't disappear entirely. There would always be a scar, but over time, it might become less painful. The next day, I nervously made my way to the agreed meeting place. The park where we were to meet was on the outskirts of the city, a quiet spot with tree-lined paths, benches, and a small pond. We had chosen the time in the evening when the daytime bustle had subsided, and it would be easier to talk without witnesses. I walked, glancing at the few passers-by, while my mind raced through all kinds of scenarios. What if James tried to start a fight? Or, what if he had a trump card that Emily had never mentioned? Either way, I resolved to keep my composure. When I got close to the designated bench, I saw a solitary figure, a tall young man in a dark coat, sitting with his chin propped on his hand, gazing toward the pond. I had seen him in photos before, in Emily's social media and in art event announcements. It felt strange to see him in person, knowing that he had once been the biggest nightmare in my inner world. Approaching him, I said, Hi. James stood up, and I noticed there was no trace of the arrogance I'd imagined. He looked rather worn out. Hi, Jacob, thanks for coming, he said quietly. Let's sit. I nodded silently. We sat on the bench a short distance apart. For a moment there was silence, as if James was searching for the right words, and I was determined not to reveal my inner tension. Finally he spoke. I understand you're not exactly thrilled to be here. I'm sure you see me as almost the embodiment of evil. Perhaps you're right. I've long been accustomed to people thinking of me as the destroyer of relationships, but I'm not here to make excuses. I just want you to know one thing. I nodded curtly, indicating that I was listening. James then looked off toward the pond. I didn't leave Emily because I had my fun with her. Yes, there was a strong passion between us, some sort of artistic understanding, but I admit I never planned for it to go that far. Anyway, that's not important. What matters is that I truly left for my career. I was offered a position at a major art studio, and only when I was in another city did I realize that she would probably come back to you. She talked about you with so much warmth, even when she was with me. It irritated me then, but now I understand that she really did love you. Maybe she just didn't know what she was choosing. Listening to him, I felt a strange mix of jealousy and pain, but I forced myself not to interrupt. James continued. Right now, I'm back on a temporary visit, and I happen to learn from mutual acquaintances that you two are trying to rebuild your relationship. That struck a chord with me. I thought maybe I should tell you that Emily wasn't lying when she said she loves you. Yes, she was with me, but she always felt guilt and torment. And, however much it might hurt you to hear this, I believe that she never completely left you emotionally. That might not make it easier for you, but I wanted you to know that she wasn't just toying with you while I was the second option. Rather, she was just lost. I rubbed my forehead, trying to absorb what he had said. Maybe it was so, but a betrayal is still a betrayal. I'm not particularly interested in what she felt at that time, I replied calmly. The main point is what she did. And your explanation doesn't ease my pain. James nodded in agreement. But there's one more thing. I won't go into details, but I know that Emily had family issues. Her parents once pressured her about her art, and she had a fear of not living up to expectations. Perhaps that's why she sought extra support and found it in me. I'm not trying to shift all the blame onto her. I just want to say, it's not all black and white. I sat there, staring at the ground. It was hard to listen to this man talk about my girlfriend, knowing he had been so close to her, but I also understood he had his own motives and perspectives. I sighed heavily. So, what exactly do you want from me? Do you want me to forgive her, or to leave her? James frowned slightly. I see that you're angry, and that's natural, but I don't need you to do either. I simply believe that if you have a chance to be together, you should know that she wasn't a cynical liar who merely used you. She was a confused woman who made a terrible mistake. I managed a bitter smile and said, that doesn't change the fact of betrayal. I already understand that she repents. But frankly, I thought you'd tell me something new, like that she lied about something else, or that you still love her. Why are we even here? James rested his elbows on his knees as if about to say something crucial. Because I don't want you to be left with the impression that Emily is just a plaything in the hands of men. And I don't want you to harbor hatred toward me. You see, I'm an artist, and I've always been drawn to dramatic stories. Perhaps I got too carried away with her, knowing she was in a relationship. And then, when things went too far, I realized I wasn't ready to take responsibility for her feelings. I'm not trying to excuse myself, but I want you to know, I won't come back to her, and I won't stand in the way of you two growing closer. You needn't fear that I'll appear again. I looked into his face, trying to discern if he was sincere. There was a note of exhaustion and perhaps regret in his tone. Maybe he truly just wanted to leave the past behind, but first he felt the need to share his perspective. I exhaled deeply. You see, it's easy for you to say, don't worry, I won't come back, but you've already left a deep scar in our history. Now I have to learn to trust Emily all over again, and no one besides the two of us knows how hard this is. Your presence only makes me relive everything over and over. James closed his eyes. Yes, I understand. Believe me, I have my own scars too. I'm not saying it was easy for me. I know you've suffered far more. But anyway, I'm leaving in a week, and it's unlikely we'll ever see each other again. For a moment, we both fell silent. The heavy, cold air of the autumn park enveloped us. I noticed that the leaves on the trees had almost all fallen, a reminder that everything ends and a new phase begins. Perhaps just as our relationship with Emily needed to wither a bit before it could be reborn, so too did we need this moment of release. I said softly, without looking at James, I appreciate what you've told me. I don't know if it makes things any easier, but at least now I have a fuller picture. He stood up from the stone bench. I'm glad you didn't physically hurt me, he said with a slight smile. I hope someday you can leave all of this behind. I also stood, and we exchanged curt nods. There were no warm parting words or handshakes. There was too much pain between us. James turned and walked down the path, slowly disappearing into the twilight. I remained for several minutes, processing the conversation. I felt a tumult inside me, but it wasn't as explosive as before, more a mix of sorrow and burnout. Maybe his words were true. Maybe he truly understood that even during her affair, Emily loved me. But did that make it any easier? I wasn't sure. The sense of betrayal remained, as did the memory of how my love had failed to keep her from straying. That evening, I sent Emily a short message. We talked. I'm okay. I'll tell you more tomorrow. She replied, I'm glad you're all right. I'm waiting for your call. Take care. I didn't want to meet her that same evening. I needed time to process everything. Instead, I walked around the city, stopped at a diner to grab a coffee to go, and sat on a bench with the hot drink, watching people pass by. I recalled James's look and his words about responsibility. That word sounded bitter in the context of our situation. No one wants to take responsibility for someone else's pain. Everyone wants to protect themselves. But if Emily and I had chosen to be together again, then I had to take responsibility for that decision. The next day, I invited Emily over. I felt I couldn't delay the conversation any longer. Our agreement to be honest demanded it. She arrived, visibly nervous. Are you okay? She asked as she stepped over the threshold. I'm fine, I replied, inviting her to sit in the kitchen. We sat down at the table. I took a bottle of juice from the fridge, poured us each a glass, and we began to talk. I recounted what James had told me. That he wasn't here to interfere with her. That he hadn't intended to demean me or abandon her. That he believed in the strength of her feelings for me. Emily listened with her eyes lowered, occasionally nodding. It was clear that hearing his name wasn't easy for her. Finally, she said, You know, there was a time when I thought he was my soulmate in art, that only he could understand all my ideas. But now I realize it was either an illusion or a temporary infatuation. Perhaps I was trying to validate myself through that. I looked at the expression on her face, sadness, regret, fatigue, and asked, So what should I make of his talk about true love and all that? Do you still have any feelings for him? Emily squeezed my hands, which were resting on the table, and said, I want you to know, I regret that part of my life. It means nothing more to me than a mistake. It was painful, but an important lesson. And now, I don't want anything more than to continue being with you if you want it. I felt a slight tremor inside, as if she was once again asking me to believe in her. I do want to, I whispered, but I can't promise that all my fears will vanish. Emily nodded and offered a sympathetic smile. I know, and I'm willing to prove that there's nothing left to doubt. We embraced, and I felt that familiar warmth. But now that warmth was different. It was filled with experience and the pain we had both endured, and perhaps that made our new closeness all the more special. Deep down, I knew that our story might not have a happy ending. We could face another crisis at any moment, another outburst of old wounds, and life, with all its unpredictability, could always throw us a curve. But now, I saw that we had a foundation, a mutual determination to keep going no matter what. Emily was no longer just a guest in my apartment. She was slowly becoming an integral part of my life. I even considered whether I should move somewhere new to erase all the old memories. But for now, we stayed here, learning not to fear the ghosts of the past. One evening, as I was finally drifting off to sleep after a long day at work, I suddenly realized that I was barely thinking about James anymore. He no longer appeared to me as the monster from my nightmares, but rather as a man who had been a catalyst for our crisis. Yes, he had caused me immense pain, but he had also opened my eyes to the fact that my relationship with Emily was not as perfect as I once believed. Perhaps that painful shakeup had led us to a more mature understanding of each other. With that thought, I fell asleep, feeling for the first time in a long while that there were no sharp edges, no lingering anger. Only fatigue and a quiet gratitude remained for the fact that I still had a chance to love and be loved, even if it meant overcoming so much. And I greeted the next day with a lighter heart. So long as we were together, so long as we could talk through our troubles, there was a future. And the past, it would remain in memory, but it wouldn't control our lives anymore. A few months later, I could say that life was gradually getting better. Emily and I had relearned how to build our relationship from scratch, immersing ourselves in everyday details and creating new shared plans. It seemed that the hardest part was behind us. We had gone through raw conversations, tears, mutual promises, and the decision to trust each other again. Of course, there were still moments of difficulty, painful images resurfaced, and the fear of relapse still lurked deep within me. But despite it all, we kept moving forward. During those months, the support of close friends was invaluable. Michael was still by my side, occasionally teasing me for being too serious about everything, yet always offering sound advice when needed. He told me that if I truly wanted to save our relationship, I needed to be deliberate rather than succumbing to panic, and I tried to follow that principle. My mom and dad, to whom I eventually confessed our story, supported me too. Even though my mom admitted she was worried about my emotional state. But once she saw I was holding up, she relaxed. On the professional front, Changes came my way as well. My company offered me a challenging new project. I gladly accepted, as immersing myself in work helped distract me from my personal turmoil. Emily, on her end, started receiving more portrait commissions and even organized a small exhibition of her work in a city gallery. I went to her opening with a bouquet of flowers, standing proudly by her side as local art critics introduced her. That moment moved me deeply. We were together in that very place where once she might have been with someone else, and now I felt that she was happy to see me there. However, as is often the case, life does not end with one drama. A few months after our new chapter began, another twist put us to the test. Perhaps the ultimate challenge for our relationship. It all started with an ordinary phone call. It was a warm spring evening, and Emily and I were sitting together in my apartment, which was still mine, discussing plans for the near future. Suddenly her phone rang, and the caller ID showed Sophia NY. At first I didn't think much of it. But then Emily's expression changed dramatically, as if she had seen something shocking or frightening. She said curtly, "I need to take this," and left into the corridor. I continued sitting in the living room, feeling a stirring inside. Who was this Sophia, and why did her call unsettle Emily so much? She had never mentioned any Sophia from New York before. I heard her talking quietly on the phone, sighing occasionally. Then she returned, pale, and said, "Jacob, we need to talk." My heart sank. Usually, "we need to talk" meant something serious. I braced myself, trying to remain calm. Emily sat down beside me, her eyes cast downward. "Remember when I told you about my dream to one day open my own gallery and move to another city? Well, my old acquaintance, Sophia, who now runs art projects in New York, called. She's offering me a chance to come there for 6 months, maybe longer, to work at their art center. It's an amazing opportunity I've dreamed about for a long time." My heart clenched. New York was far away. If Emily went for 6 months, it would mean we'd be apart again. After everything we'd been through, I wasn't sure I could handle such a prolonged separation, but I tried not to show my immediate emotions and asked, "So, what do you think? Do you want to go?" Emily looked at me, uncertain. "I don't know. On one hand, it's a dream, a chance to show my work in one of the world's leading art centers. But on the other, I know what it means for us. I don't want to risk our relationship again." We sat in silence, and I felt a storm of emotions building inside me. But remembering our agreement to be honest, I tried to speak openly. "I understand how important this is to you, but I won't lie, I'm scared. I'm afraid that the distance will tear open the barely healed wounds between us. I fear that we'll grow apart, and you might find someone else again." I faltered, knowing how painful those words sounded, but they were the truth. Emily squeezed my hand. "I don't want to hurt you again. But I also can't turn down such an opportunity. It would be a major step for my career and personal growth. And I've dreamed of New York for so long, but if you say it's unacceptable, I'll probably decline. Although then I feel like I'm missing out on my dream." My head spun. I knew that if I said no, you can't go, I'd be acting selfishly, but perhaps it would keep her here. On the other hand, I didn't want to be the one who crushed her prospects. And what if she eventually regretted it, and it turned into yet another chasm between us? The silence grew unbearable, and I said, "Let's think about it for a couple of days. I need to get used to the idea. And you too, probably." Emily nodded, and I saw tears in her eyes. I pulled her into an embrace and murmured, "Don't cry. Everything will be okay. We'll find a solution." But inside, I didn't know what solution there could be. Not long ago, we had barely managed to pull our relationship back from the brink after the betrayal, and now distance threatened to tear us apart again. Not for a week or two, but for 6 months, or maybe even longer. How could we endure that when we were still walking a tightrope of fragile trust? That night was restless. I woke repeatedly, feeling the cold emptiness beside me even though Emily lay in my arms. In the morning, I went to work with a heavy heart, distracted by thoughts of what our life would be like if she left. Yet other thoughts also came. What if, having overcome the infidelity, we could also overcome the distance? Perhaps it would even serve as a test, proving that we had grown stronger. That evening, we sat again at the negotiation table in my living room. Emily was visibly anxious, eager to hear my thoughts. I laid out all my emotions honestly, my fear, my hope, and said that I didn't want to be the one to shatter her dream, but I also didn't want to lose our closeness. She replied, "I appreciate your honesty, Jacob. I was thinking maybe we could try. We have phones, video calls, and I promise to come visit as soon as I can. And you can come here too. It won't be forever, it's just 6 months, maybe a year at most." Clenching my jaw, I considered. On one hand, 6 months wasn't an eternity, but on the other, it was a long time. However, I saw the burning determination in her eyes when she talked about New York and the opportunities that awaited. Finally, I sighed heavily. "If you're truly willing to invest in our relationship from a distance as much as you are now, let's try. But promise me that we'll talk regularly and meet as often as possible." Emily exhaled in relief, then threw her arms around me and said, "Thank you for giving me a chance. I promise I'll do everything to get through this together." The following weeks moved at a frantic pace. Emily handled visa documents, arranged her New York accommodation, and prepared her portfolio. I helped as much as I could, though deep inside, a constant anxiety gnawed at me. Time flew by, and soon it was the day of her departure. We went together to the airport, where she hugged me goodbye, whispering, "I love you. I'll be back, I promise." I held her tight, feeling my heart tighten with both pain and fear. Then, she disappeared behind the check-in counter, and I was left alone with a hollow feeling, reminiscent of the moment when she had once left me after her confession. But now I understood. We weren't breaking up because our love was over, but because we were chasing new horizons. In a way, it was even more painful, yet somehow brighter. There was no bitter resentment, only anxiety for the future. Thus began our long-distance phase. We called each other almost every day, exchanged lengthy messages about how our days had gone, and shared photographs. Emily told me about her first steps at the art center, about the new people she met, and how thrilled she was by the energy of New York. I recounted my work, city news, and updates about friends. Video calls became a lifeline against loneliness, for at least I could see her face and hear her voice. But no technology could replace the feeling of being physically together, of hugging, of strolling the city side by side. After 2 months, having taken some vacation days, I decided to fly to her. It was my first trip to the USA, and I was anxious about how our reunion would go. We missed each other terribly, texting 1,000 messages about it, but I remembered how we had once walked the edge of the abyss of distrust and fear. Would we be able to restore that warmth when we saw each other face to face without awkwardness? I remember the moment I stepped into the arrival area at JFK Airport and saw her standing there with a sign reading, "Jacob, welcome to NY," and a sheepish smile. It felt like, in a split second, I shed the exhaustion of the long flight and ran into her embrace. We stood there, unself-consciously, hugging so tightly as if we hadn't seen each other for an eternity. I felt her trembling, and I could barely hold back tears of joy. That week in New York passed in the blink of an eye. Emily showed me galleries where her exhibitions were planned. We strolled through Central Park, enjoyed the bustling streets of Manhattan, and even listened to street musicians in the subway together. We stayed in a small apartment she shared with another artist. Despite the cramped conditions, I was happy, simply because I was with her. For a while, everything seemed wonderful. At one point, I even found myself thinking, if we're this happy here, maybe I should move in with her? But alas, it wasn't that easy with my job. Besides, everything was happening too fast. I wasn't ready to leave my life, friends, and career behind. Emily also understood that such a drastic step was too sudden. But after spending that week together, I became convinced that distance wouldn't kill us if we continued to communicate, visit each other, and support one another. When it was time for me to return, we cried together at the airport once again, but this time with the hope that we'd see each other again in a couple of months, when she would come home for a few weeks of vacation. I flew back, carrying with me a torrent of emotions and hundreds of photographs of us laughing, kissing, and wandering the streets of that vast metropolis. Thus, we spent the next few months. I immersed myself in work, kept in touch with Michael, and occasionally met friends. Some of them couldn't understand how I could maintain a long-distance relationship after everything that had happened. But I believed it was temporary, that Emily would return, and we could start a completely new life here. One that wouldn't be the same as before, but better. However, as is often the case, fate did not follow our plans. The next twist came in the form of a phone call from Emily one evening. She told me that her contract at the art center had been extended by another 6 months, and that she now faced a choice, either return home in 2 months as planned or sign the extension and stay in New York. The news hit me like a sledgehammer. I had thought everything was moving toward a reunion, and now the prospect of another 6 months apart loomed. I heard a note of worry in her voice. "Jacob, I don't know what to do. This is such an opportunity, but I promised I'd come back." Inside, I felt my chest tighten as I realized the risk this posed to our relationship. Not everyone could endure a year or more apart, especially after all we'd been through. But I didn't want to pressure her either. Struggling to gather my thoughts, I managed to say, "This is your future. I can't take that away from you. But we must understand that this is an even greater test for us." Emily admitted that her work was giving her a creative boost, new contacts, opportunities to exhibit, and to earn more. She was grateful for my support, yet she was also afraid that if she returned now, she'd miss out on this chance. I tried to be rational, suggesting that we could plan for me to visit more often, or for her to take breaks and come home whenever possible. But my heart ached at the thought that our temporary separation might turn into something permanent. In the end, she asked for a week to think it over. I agreed. But during that week, I suffered terribly, scarcely finding any relief from my anxiety. Old fears resurfaced. The painful image of her being drawn to someone else far away. Yet I reminded myself that this was the same Emily who had fought with me to rebuild our trust. She had a chance to deceive me again or leave, but she chose to be honest and open. I had to hold on to that thought, or our relationship would be doomed. After 7 agonizing days, Emily told me she had decided to extend her contract. She apologized, aware that it put me back in a state of waiting, but hoped that we could make it work. She said one of her new acquaintances at the art center had even invited her to move into their shared studio, which would cut costs and allow her to save more for trips home. I swallowed hard, trying not to show how much it hurt, and said simply, "Okay, I'll try to understand." And so we carried on, planning new meeting dates. She promised to fly home for Christmas, and I planned to visit her in the spring. Video calls became our ritual, and time flew by quickly, yet dragged on painfully at the same time. I noticed that I increasingly longed for the normalcy of having my loved one close by. But when I saw the bright look in her eyes as she talked about her new projects, I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing by giving her the freedom to grow. Sometimes we quarreled over the distance, when video call schedules fell apart, or when Emily was late in replying to my messages citing busyness. I felt a pang of jealousy toward her new environment, her new friends. She chided me for not trusting her since she had given me no reason to doubt her loyalty after that terrible lesson. Fortunately, our arguments never escalated into long-term conflicts. We both knew our relationship was hanging by a thread, and that only patience and mutual understanding could save it. A few months later, that all-too-familiar fear returned. What if it's all for nothing? What if we're just wasting time, and eventually realize we're living in parallel worlds? But when those thoughts became too intrusive, I reminded myself of how we had clawed our way out of the deepest pit of betrayal. And that if our love was real, distance was just another challenge we could overcome. Time would tell where this long road would lead. I could only hope that one day we'd meet and no longer have to say goodbye for so long. If we had survived the betrayal and managed to forgive each other, perhaps this separation would only make us stronger. I wasn't sure if our story would have a happy ending, but one thing was clear. We had both grown, learned to be honest and open. And that meant our chances of being together someday were higher than before. And even if fate decreed otherwise, I would always remember that we did everything possible to preserve and rekindle our love. Several long months passed, full of waiting, hope, and doubt. I had grown accustomed to living in 2 realities. One here in my hometown, where friends, work, and familiar roots remained, and another far away, across the ocean, where Emily was pursuing her creative dream. We were like 2 hearts connected by an invisible thread, struggling not to let it snap, despite growing tension and daily routine. Words like trust and openness still lay at the core of our relationship. I openly shared my worries, and she spoke about the tough moments at the art center and how lonely she sometimes felt in an unfamiliar country. Occasionally, we both felt the pain of missing out on the simple, everyday joys of being together. But whenever despair threatened to overwhelm us, we remembered that we had already survived an even more terrifying ordeal. The betrayal that could have destroyed everything. And if we had found the strength to rebuild then, surely we could withstand this too. At some point, we began discussing concrete plans for the future. Emily said that in a couple of months her contract would definitely end, and she wanted to come back. The exhaustion of being in a foreign city, the endless race after projects, had finally taken its toll. "I feel that New York has given me so much, but I don't want to stay here forever," she said during a video call. "I miss you. I miss our places. I miss the little joys we shared. And after all, even if they keep calling me, I can always come home on short assignments. I don't have to uproot completely." Those words were like a breath of fresh air to me. I had waited for this moment so long that sometimes I even doubted she would ever return. And yet, fears still lingered. What if, upon returning, we realize we've grown too far apart? What if we can't ever merge our lives again? But I tried to dismiss those thoughts, for there was no evidence that our bond had weakened significantly. The distance, the endless cycle of daily responsibilities, the inability to be physically close, these were all painful, but we persevered. I confess, sometimes I felt as though I were living in a long-term state of waiting. Occasionally I asked myself, am I waiting for some happy ending, just as I did when I waited for forgiveness after her betrayal? But I quickly shut those thoughts down. This time, things were different. We were in sync, supporting each other, and above all, we were being honest. The time for her contract's end was approaching. Emily informed me that she would be flying home in midsummer. That news filled me with hope. I pictured meeting her at the airport and us building new plans. Maybe finding a home together where we could start fresh. I saw in our texts that Emily too dreamed of waking up next to me again, sharing morning coffee, taking spontaneous trips out of town. But just a couple of weeks before her return, events took an unexpected turn. She sent me a frantic message. "Jacob, I've just been offered a collaboration with a renowned gallery if I agree to stay another 3 to 4 months. This is an incredible opportunity. I don't know what to do. I already bought my ticket home, and now they're urging me to cancel and extend my stay. I'm confused." Reading those words, I felt that familiar sting in my chest. The same decision loomed again? Once more, a delay, meaning we'd be apart across continents? I had been preparing for her return, for the end of our long-distance pain. And now the prospect of another delay struck me hard. Contradictory emotions flooded over me. On one hand, I understood that such an opportunity was truly significant for her career. On the other, I was exhausted, tired of living in a half-imagined relationship where real presence was replaced by calls and messages, tired of constantly suppressing jealousy when she talked about new acquaintances and events where I was but a distant presence. Trying not to react impulsively, I asked her to talk over video. When Emily appeared on the screen, I saw her anxiously awaiting my response. "I know this puts us in a difficult spot," she began. "But understand me. This gallery offer is a chance to make a name for myself in the art world. Everything is falling into place. I'm finally being noticed. If I leave now, I might never get another chance like this." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to lash out. Taking a deep breath, I said quietly, "Emily, I've always tried to support your ambitions, but I can't help but admit that I'm on the edge right now. I truly believed that this time you'd come back. We had plans for the coming months. Now everything is being postponed again." Her eyes glistened. "I understand, and I'm truly sorry. I'm just trying to fulfill my potential as an artist, and if I miss this chance, I'll regret it. I promise I'll do everything to make this period as short as possible so we can see each other more often. But please, support me one more time. This is my final push, and then I'll have a solid foundation to work from back home." I closed my eyes, searching for balance inside. I wanted to scream that I was tired, that I couldn't continue living in a state of endless separation. But I remembered all the strength we had mustered to reach this point, remembered our journey from the pain of betrayal to our renewed love. And I suddenly realized I had no right to force her to abandon her career. Yes, I had every right to express my feelings, but I couldn't command her to return. After a long silence, I said, "Emily, I don't want you to regret missing out on a chance. I'll trust you one last time. Do what you believe is right, but know that I have my limits. If you think that a few more months in New York is crucial for your future, then fine. But I really hope this will be the last extension, because I'm not sure I can keep holding on." She sniffled softly, promising that everything would be all right, and that this time, it was truly decisive. In the end, she agreed to postpone her return and sign the gallery contract. I felt our destinies pulling us apart again. Yet a small inner voice told me that we had already overcome too much to give up now. 3 months passed in tense anticipation. I lived from one call to the next, from one message to another. We planned that I would take time off, and in the final month of her stay in New York, I would fly to her so we could arrange our homecoming together. She was excited, writing about how her curator praised her, about an article in an art magazine featuring her work. I rejoiced for her, yet deep down, I longed intensely for her to return sooner. The day came when I once again stood at the airport, holding a ticket to New York. I was to spend the remaining weeks of her contract there, and then we would return home together. On the plane, I recalled all our previous flights, how she had left in tears, how I'd rushed to meet her. All those scenes flashed before my eyes. I knew that in this trip, everything would be decided. Either we would finally prove that we were meant to be together, or we'd realize that our paths had diverged. When I stepped into the arrivals hall, Emily greeted me with the same sign as before, but this time it read, "Finally coming home together." I smiled, seeing her radiant eyes. We embraced, and it seemed as though she had lost weight, looked more refreshed, yet in her there shone the extraordinary energy of an artist who had found her place. We spent 3 unforgettable weeks in New York, and I saw how hard she tried to give me all her attention despite her busy schedule at the gallery. I even attended one of her open events, where she presented her series of portraits, and my heart swelled with pride for her. Most importantly, I felt that Emily truly needed me, that she wasn't slipping back into her own world as she had once done. Of course, we didn't avoid conflicts entirely. There were times when I didn't understand why she was coming back so late from the gallery, when I felt jealous of her colleagues. We argued a couple of times, but quickly made up, recalling all we had been through. We promised each other that this would be the last escape in New York, after which we would live together in our hometown, building her career on a solid foundation of reputation. Finally, the day of her departure arrived. Together, we gathered her paintings, sketches, and belongings, packed everything into boxes, and then, hand in hand, went through the airport formalities and boarded a flight, gazing at each other as if it were the end of a long chapter. I saw a complex mix of emotions on her face. She was leaving behind a big city that had been part of her dream, yet coming back to me. That was also her dream. To live together, never to be apart for too long again. When we stepped onto our home turf and exited the arrivals hall, Michael and a couple of our friends greeted us with shouts of, "Finally! Welcome back!" I stood there, holding Emily by the shoulder, and felt the tears welling up as I realized how many challenges we had overcome, and yet we still wanted to share our lives together. The next day, we woke up in my apartment, the same place where this entire saga had begun, from blissful infatuation to bitter betrayal and long separation. But now, I felt that we were returning as different people. Emily looked at me sleepily and smiled. "Good morning. I missed our quiet mornings so much." I squeezed her hand and replied, "I miss them too. Now I hope they become a permanent part of our lives." And although we faced the challenges of adapting to a new life together, finding a new home, sorting out her commissions and my projects, I was no longer afraid. I knew we had been through hell, betrayal, forgiveness, distance, and that it had only made us stronger. Our journey was far from perfect. We made mistakes, and at times we lost our way in doubts, but each time we chose each other again, and that meant it wasn't all for nothing. Thus continued our shared story, a story in which we still sought a balance between creativity and personal life, between honest conversations and caring for each other's feelings. We were no longer the naive lovers who once met at Michael's party. We had grown stronger and wiser, though not without the bitterness of past disappointments. Perhaps there would be new challenges ahead, but we knew one thing for sure. If we could overcome betrayal and separation, then we had every chance of preserving and even growing our love. And everything else was just the scenery that life changed as it saw fit.